On that fateful day, Brazil witnessed one of the most tragic moments in its history. TAM Flight 354, a routine trip that ended in devastation, left the entire nation in shock and mourning. But what really happened in those final moments? How did a single flight become the deadliest air disaster in Brazil's history? Today we'll revisit that unforgettable day, shedding light on the complex factors that led to the tragedy and exploring the lasting impact it had on safety regulations and the lives of countless families. On that fateful July day, TAM Flight 354 departed from Porto Alegre, Brazil, on a routine domestic flight to São Paulo. The aircraft, an Airbus A320, carried 181 passengers and 6 crew members, all expecting an uneventful journey to one of Brazil's busiest airports, Congonhas. Known for its central location in São Paulo and close proximity to densely populated areas, Congonhas was a preferred airport for travelers, but also presented unique challenges for pilots, particularly due to its short runways and heavy traffic. As the flight neared São Paulo, weather conditions began to deteriorate. Rain had left the runway slick, increasing the difficulty of landing, especially at Congonhas, where pilots already had limited room for error. The crew of TAM 354 was well aware of these challenges. They were experienced and trained to handle such conditions. Yet, they were also depending on the proper functionality of the aircraft's equipment and the airport's facilities to ensure a safe landing. Complicating matters further, Congonhas had recently undergone resurfacing to improve the runway's grip. However, the application of grooves to channel water away from the surface, a critical feature for wet weather landings, was delayed. This meant that the slick runway lacked a key element to aid in braking, presenting an added risk to flights landing that day. At the time, neither the passengers nor the crew knew that these subtle conditions were aligning to create a hazardous scenario. What seemed like another rainy landing in São Paulo would soon reveal hidden dangers. The stage was set, and as TAM 354 approached for its final descent, the risks that lay beneath the surface were poised to turn a routine flight into a national tragedy. As TAM Flight 354 approached São Paulo's Congonhas airport, the cockpit crew prepared for a landing that, while challenging, was something they had practiced countless times before. The pilots were aware of the rainy weather and the runway's reputation for being slippery in such conditions. But what they didn't know was that the lack of grooves on the recently resurfaced runway would prevent water from draining effectively, making braking even more difficult. In the cockpit, the pilots were following standard landing procedures, adjusting their speed and altitude to approach the short runway carefully. However, a critical mistake was unknowingly made during the descent. The right engine's throttle lever had been left in the climb position instead of being set to idle. This error was small yet crucial. While the left engine was set to decelerate upon touchdown, the right engine continued to provide thrust, effectively pushing the aircraft forward when it needed to slow down. As the plane made contact with the wet runway, the pilots quickly realized something was wrong. The A320 began to skid, and they were unable to gain control over the aircraft's speed. In the seconds that followed, the cockpit recordings captured the pilots' alarm as they struggled to understand why the plane wasn't slowing. Despite their best efforts, the plane continued to barrel down the runway, gaining momentum rather than losing it. At this point, the slick surface combined with the engine's opposing settings made it nearly impossible to bring the aircraft to a halt. The crew's confusion turned to panic as they realized the end of the runway was approaching fast. They attempted various braking maneuvers, but with one engine still pushing forward, their efforts were futile. Within seconds, the aircraft raced past the end of the runway, crossing over a major road and slamming into a building and a fuel depot just beyond the airport's boundary. In the final seconds, the cockpit recordings captured the devastating realization that the pilots would not be able to stop the plane. The impact was immediate and catastrophic, triggering a massive explosion that engulfed the building, the plane, and everything in its path. In a moment, the lives of everyone on board and several individuals on the ground were lost. The tragedy left the crew's families, the airline, and the country asking a haunting question. How could a seemingly routine error result in such catastrophic consequences? As investigators would later discover, the deadly combination of the runway's slick surface, the throttle misconfiguration, and the airport's limited safety measures created an almost inevitable outcome. This fatal convergence of factors serves as a stark reminder of how in aviation, even a small oversight can snowball into an irreversible disaster. The scene at Congonhas Airport was one of immediate chaos and horror. As TAM Flight 3054 raced past the end of the runway, it crossed a major road before crashing into a TAM cargo building and a nearby fuel depot. The resulting explosion sent flames and thick black smoke into the air, a sight visible from miles away. People nearby heard the deafening blast, and those within the airport terminal and surrounding areas were struck by the magnitude of what was unfolding before them. Emergency response teams were dispatched within minutes, but they faced a fierce blaze that was difficult to control. The heat from the explosion was intense, forcing responders to work at a distance as they struggled to contain the flames. The fire was relentless, fueled by the fuel depot and the wreckage itself, making immediate rescue efforts nearly impossible. Nearby roads became congested as onlookers gathered, horrified by the unfolding tragedy, and family members of those on the flight waited in agony, hoping for some miracle amid the devastation. Inside the terminal, news of the accident spread quickly, and soon families, friends, and employees realized the horror that had befallen their loved ones. Phones began to ring as relatives and friends tried to reach passengers, but with no response. In a matter of moments, the anticipation of a safe landing had turned into heartbreak, and the airport was gripped by a wave of grief and disbelief. The devastation extended beyond the passengers and crew. Several individuals in the TAM building lost their lives as well, and the impact of the crash left the area in ruins. This tragedy wasn't just a single incident, it became a national catastrophe, affecting hundreds of families and shaking the entire country. News networks captured the aftermath, broadcasting images of the smoke, flames, and remains of the aircraft as Brazilians across the country watched in shock and sorrow. As the flames subsided and the scale of the loss became apparent, the immediate aftermath left a profound sense of emptiness and grief. For Brazil, July 17, 2007, would be remembered not just as a day of loss, but as a turning point, a tragic reminder of the importance of aviation safety, and a call to understand how such a disaster could occur and how it might be prevented in the future. But as the hours passed, the devastating reality became undeniable. Scenes of grief filled the media, with images of family members in tears, clasping each other for comfort and holding photos of those they had lost. The accident didn't just claim lives, it shattered families, leaving parents, children, spouses, and friends to grapple with a profound and unimaginable loss. For many, this was a tragedy that struck close to home. Almost everyone knew someone who had been affected or knew someone who had lost a loved one. Brazil was united in grief, and cities across the country held vigils and moments of silence to honor the victims. Government officials and airline representatives offered public statements of condolence, yet nothing could ease the pain felt by those who had been left behind. The entire nation paused in solidarity, with people from all walks of life expressing their sorrow and paying respects. The tragedy also sparked a fierce demand for answers, with citizens and media outlets questioning how such an accident could happen and why safety protocols failed so catastrophically. The tragedy of TAM Flight 3054 was not merely an aviation disaster, it was a national trauma that left a deep emotional scar. For Brazil, the accident became a shared grief and a somber reminder of life's fragility, leaving a permanent mark on the collective memory of a nation determined to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. Following the tragedy, investigators from Brazil's Center for Investigation and Prevention of Aeronautical Accidents, CINIPA, and other international aviation agencies launched an extensive inquiry into the events leading up to the crash. Their objective was clear: to understand every factor that contributed to the catastrophe and to ensure that similar tragedies could be prevented in the future. Through meticulous analysis, they uncovered a series of technical and procedural failures that culminated in the disaster of TAM Flight 3054. One of the primary causes identified was the incorrect positioning of the throttle levers, specifically the right engine's throttle, which was left in the climb position instead of idle. While this might seem like a minor error, its impact was devastating. With the left engine set to idle and the right engine still providing thrust, the aircraft was pushed forward, even as it attempted to land, preventing it from decelerating properly. This imbalance in thrust created a dangerous scenario where braking became ineffective, leading the plane to continue its forward momentum down the slick runway. Compounding this issue was the condition of the runway itself. Congonhas Airport's main runway had recently been resurfaced, and while this would normally improve safety, the resurfacing had not yet been completed with grooves to channel water away. Without these grooves, rainwater remained on the surface, making it unusually slippery and further hampering the aircraft's ability to stop. This combination of excessive thrust on one side and a slick runway created an almost uncontrollable scenario for the pilots, who were left struggling to regain control. Another crucial factor was the absence of an adequate runway overrun area, which is an extended space beyond the runway intended to provide a safety buffer in case of landing issues. At Congonhas, the short runway ended abruptly with no extended safety area, leaving little room for error. This meant that once the aircraft ran out of runway, there was nowhere else to go but across the surrounding roads and into buildings, a flaw that intensified the impact and increased the fatalities. The investigation also shed light on the pressures faced by pilots and airlines to maintain strict schedules, often under challenging conditions. While the crew was highly trained, the demands placed on them, combined with the adverse weather and runway conditions, created an environment ripe for critical errors. The cockpit voice recordings revealed the crew's growing confusion as they tried to troubleshoot what they believed was a standard landing, unaware that one small oversight had compromised their entire approach. Ultimately, this investigation revealed that the tragedy of TAM Flight 3054 was not caused by a single issue, but by a series of compounding factors: human error, environmental conditions, and infrastructural inadequacies. These findings underscored the complex interplay between pilot actions, aircraft mechanics, and airport infrastructure, and highlighted the need for improvements in each area. For aviation authorities, the accident was a stark reminder of how essential rigorous safety standards are in all aspects of flight operations. Beyond the technical details, the tragedy of TAM Flight 3054 left behind personal stories of loss that continue to resonate deeply within Brazil. Each passenger on that flight had a life, a family, dreams, and a story that was abruptly cut short. Among them were business travelers, families on vacation, and even children looking forward to reuniting with loved ones. Their stories transformed the crash from a statistical tragedy into a profoundly human loss, one that would leave hundreds of families mourning and seeking answers. For the families, the days following the accident were filled with unimaginable grief. Many gathered at Congonhas Airport, hoping for some news, a last-minute miracle or closure. The pain was compounded by the suddenness of the tragedy. These were loved ones who had been expected to return home safely, but instead, their lives had ended in an unforeseen disaster. Families clung to memories, photos, and stories, while Brazil as a nation empathized with their pain, understanding that this was a shared loss. In the wake of the crash, memorials and tributes were held across the country. Communities organized vigils, and countless people paid their respects, sending condolences and flowers. For many, the crash became more than just a news story. It was a reminder of the fragile nature of life. Those who survived or knew someone on the flight were left with a lasting imprint of grief and solidarity, a bond formed from the shared loss and the awareness that safety in aviation is paramount. The legacy of the victims lives on, not only through the memories held by their loved ones, but also through the reforms and safety measures that followed. In this way, the lives lost in TAM 3054 continue to impact Brazil's approach to aviation safety, ensuring that they are remembered and honored through meaningful change. The tragedy of TAM Flight 3054 became a powerful catalyst for significant changes in aviation safety policies in Brazil. In the wake of the accident, the Brazilian government, aviation authorities, and Congonhas Airport implemented a series of reforms designed to address the specific issues that contributed to the crash, with the hope of preventing such a disaster from ever happening again. One of the immediate changes involved the runway conditions at Congonhas Airport. Recognizing the critical role that a properly grooved runway plays in water drainage and braking performance, authorities expedited the process of installing grooves on the runway surface. This measure ensured that rainwater could be effectively channeled away, reducing the risk of hydroplaning and improving braking capacity in wet conditions. Additionally, during times of heavy rain, stricter restrictions on landings were imposed, limiting runway use to enhance safety. In response to the absence of a runway overrun area, the government also implemented regulations to improve airport infrastructure throughout Brazil, especially at high-traffic airports like Congonhas. Since the space around Congonhas Airport was limited, significant modifications were made to enhance safety measures, such as installing concrete arrestor beds, specialized materials that can slow an aircraft in case of an overrun. These changes address the lack of a safety buffer, creating a critical margin that could prevent future overruns from becoming catastrophic. Another area of reform focused on pilot training and airline procedures. Airlines were required to reinforce procedures regarding throttle settings and landing protocols, emphasizing the importance of cross-checks and standardization to prevent misconfigurations. This adjustment was intended to minimize the risk of similar technical oversights in future operations, reminding pilots and crew of the critical role they play in ensuring flight safety. On a larger scale, the TAM 3054 disaster also prompted the Brazilian aviation industry to adopt a more proactive approach towards safety oversight and regulation. Enhanced audits, more rigorous safety inspections, and closer collaboration between airlines and regulatory bodies became the new norm, helping to create a culture of accountability and safety awareness that extends beyond individual flights. This comprehensive approach to safety has had a lasting impact, fostering improvements in operational procedures, training, and infrastructure across Brazil. The legacy of Flight 3054 endures in the lives of those who were left behind, families and friends who continue to remember their loved ones and honor their memory. Their loss is a reminder to all of us of the stakes involved in air travel and the human cost of lapses in safety protocols. Today, every time a plane lands safely on a rainy runway, every time pilots double-check their instruments, every time an airport upgrades its infrastructure, the lessons of TAM 3054 are present, silently guiding these actions. This tragedy also instilled a lasting impact on Brazilian aviation, leading to reforms that extended far beyond Congonhas Airport. The changes implemented have made air travel safer for everyone, a legacy that honors those who lost their lives. For Brazil and the aviation world, TAM Flight 3054 serves as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the face of profound loss, meaningful change can arise. As we look back on this day, we remember not only the details of the tragedy, but also the lessons learned and the lives changed. TAM Flight 3054 will forever be a part of Brazil's history, a chapter filled with sorrow, reflection, and an unwavering commitment to safer skies.